make sure that we have all the information to send to you and to others. You will get a training hour for today. And with anything, and if anyone has any questions before we get started, I'm sorry, does anybody have any questions before we get started? Just some updates or anything like that? All right, if not, I will turn everything over to our presenter for this whole month, who is Mr. Kyle Wood, and he's going to give us some good gardening tips to get us going in our gardens, because that's what I know everybody wants to do. You're tired of that cold weather coming through. So, Kyle, I'm going to turn everything over to you to introduce yourself and to let us know what we're going to be going through for the rest of this month.
Thanks, Sharonda. I'll share my screen and we can get started with today's learning bursts. Okay, can everybody see my screen pretty well? Perfect. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about garden planning for young children. I know you all work at ECE sites, so gardening for this population is really important. So we're going to talk about just some really basic ways to garden at your sites, some ways to sort of integrate it into your sort of day-to-day curricula. And again, my name's Kyle Hood. I'm the Garden Collaborative Extension Associate with the Steps to Health program at North Carolina State University. And a few things we'll be just chatting about today. So why is gardening important? How to start a garden at your center, or maybe expand a garden at your center. Maybe you already have a garden, how to expand it or start one. We'll be sort of focusing on the audience. So gardening with young children, very different than gardening, let's say, with like college students. And then your physical space. So how do we maximize whatever physical space you have? And then planning a garden, which is also really important. I know your centers are all across North Carolina, so it might look different in Boone than, say, Winston-Salem, just for planning our garden, when we put plants out, things like that. And then I'll sort of touch on the lesson planning piece, which is also really important as well. You'll be seeing me all month, so please, if there's certain garden topics you'd like to hear about later in the month, please put them in the chat. I'll be sure to weave them into my learning bursts throughout the month. So why do we emphasize gardening? My background is in nutrition. I have 2 degrees in nutrition, so I'm really focusing on that nutrition aspect of gardening. But the great thing about gardening and these spaces is that we can teach math skills, we can teach art, we can teach, nutrition, horticulture. We can teach all these skills in a garden space. So there's a lot of great reasons to garden. I'm going to focus on a few that are more health focused. So I have 10 different food items. Some people wouldn't even call them food, but I have 10 different things that you can eat on this slide, right? And this is kind of representative of food marketing in the United States. So these young children that are in your centers, adults in America, really anybody, this is what they're seeing on the screens we watch every day, on the billboards we look at. And if 8 out of 10 things on this slide are, I would say, unhealthy would be a good way to put it, then this is what we're thinking about when we want to go get food. What, I'm hungry, let's go get McDonald's, I'll get this burger and fry right here. This peach and radish are few and far between. And so exposing children to gardening at a young age can kind of help combat this. Obviously, there's $14 billion in food advertising coming at Americans each year. That number's probably grown since I made this slide last year. So we have a lot of work to do, but gardening is a good place to start because it's showing kids a lot of things, but it's showing them where their food comes from. It's almost an advertisement for healthy food that you can grow yourself. Another great reason to garden is physical activity. These are just some very basic recommendations from the CDC, but adults need at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity a week. Gardening is a great way to do that for all you teachers and, leads at childcare centers. And then most children need about an hour of physical activity a day. Again, gardening is a great way to do that. it doesn't even really feel like work a lot of the time, if you're enjoying it, which I think is part of the trick to it. But another great reason to be gardening with this population is just increase that physical activity and make it fun for them. Some other benefits of gardening. This is actually a picture of some children at a garden that I used to work with about 10 years ago. They're just playing in the garden. And actually these benefits, I've seen this firsthand. So gardening programs with young children increases their willingness to try fruits and vegetables, and it can increase their fruit and vegetable consumption as well. So two other really important reasons why gardening can work for this population. And in this instance, I got to work in this garden for 3 years. I was a college student teaching gardening and nutrition skills to these preschoolers, and the difference I would see in them in 9 months of gardening was amazing. One day we were going to plant beans, and we all walked by these kale plants that had been there for a while because kale can last and last. And as we're walking by the kale to plant the beans, each kid in my group just took a piece of kale, put it in their mouth and ate it. Whereas when I started working with them, they didn't even know what kale was. They wouldn't touch it. And I didn't tell any of them to pick the kale. So just seeing how much more comfortable they are with fruits and vegetables that they're growing was kind of eye-opening for me. And one of the reasons why I kind of got into this work in the first place. So let's say we're starting a garden in our childcare center, or expanding it, or revitalizing it. There's a lot of things we should consider each year, especially that initial startup. So we'll kind of talk about that sustainability piece, the audience, which in this case is young children, why we're gardening, what's the purpose of our garden, because every garden is different, right? And then who should we partner with to make it more successful? So that sustainability plan and purpose. And I think the first question we should ask ourselves is, what's the vision for my space? And that might change every year, but I mainly work with childcare centers and schools to help them plan their gardens, to help them expand their gardens. And the main type of garden I see at schools are educational gardens, which is very different than, let's say, a production garden. In a production garden, I'm only worried about the pounds of produce I'm getting, how well everything did. You know, I'm really, really intense about my schedule, all that stuff. But in an educational garden, it's much more about trial and error. Are we teaching them skills around gardening, around nutrition? It's a much more safe space that, you know, it's okay if a bunch of aphids destroyed our tomatoes, because now we know what aphids are. We learn about their life cycle. Much different than, let's say, a production garden. And then who's going to maintain a garden? So before you start a garden, before you make your garden bigger, have no illusions that gardening is work, right? And even if we only have, let's say, 4 raised beds at our site, someone's going to have to manage that and take care of it and put some thought into it. Otherwise, it's going to turn into like a weedy mess after 6 months, a year. So it's important to go into it knowing that, okay, we need some dedicated people at our site to work on this project. Maybe we involve parents. We get the students out there once a week helping the garden, learning those basic skills. But it really takes a village to maintain a garden, make it look great, and be useful at your centers, I think. So let's talk about the audience. I think for most of you, we're talking about gardens that are meant to serve young children as a learning space. And there's some things we need to consider with that population. You might look online and, you know, see a raised bed that's 4 feet wide, and that's pretty standard. Or they might tell you to put an in-ground garden that's 4 feet wide. But, you know, a 4-year-old or a 3-year-old at my site probably can't reach their hand into the middle of that space without getting in the bed, right? So we need to think smaller, think safety, think little people working in these spaces rather than adults. There's a lot of ways to look at that, so we'll kind of touch on that more later. But thinking about who will be working in the space is really the first thing we should consider before we expand our project. And then partners. Having strong partners is really important. You can get a lot of support, a lot of maybe free materials, depending on who your partners are. Extension is a great partner. You know, I work for Extension, so I might be a little biased, but if you email me any garden question, I'd be happy to answer that. Those are my favorite questions to get in my inbox. You know, a picture of an insect. What is this? How do I deal with it? Extension in your county as well. There's probably a horticulture agent in your county that's happy maybe to even come out to your site and look at your garden and tell you, you know, maybe what you could improve, what you're doing well. Extension's a great resource. Local farm and garden stores as well. So, you know, telling them your story, telling them about, you know, we're starting a garden at our school. We want the kids to learn these skills. Could you donate any supplies? You'd be surprised how often they say yes. And, you know, it might be scary to ask initially, but I've gotten a lot of free supplies as a garden coordinator in my past life. Just asking that question, whether it's uncomfortable or not, you'd be surprised how often they're excited about your cause and what you're doing. And then nonprofits related to farm and ECE and gardening. There's a lot of nonprofits out there that have like seed mini grants that small gardens can apply for to get free seeds or free garden supplies. So kind of keeping your eyes open and not making it just about what you're doing and your staff are doing, but kind of opening it up, getting help from others can really make the project more sustainable. So let's talk about your physical space, whether you've already started a garden, whether you would like to start a garden. The amazing thing about gardening and really garden education is like whatever space you have, you can make it work for this function. So on the top left, we have maybe like a deck. On the top right, we have a patch of grass. We have a windowsill in the bottom left and a closet on the bottom right. And you can really garden in all of these spaces in different ways. And maybe you only have access to one of these spaces, but that doesn't mean you can't do some fun activities at your site. So the first one we'll talk about is raised beds. And this picture on the left is actually of my house. That was my son a few years ago, just hanging out in my garden with some of my chickens. You can kind of see the raised beds really at his level. It's easy for him to access that raised bed. This picture on the right, I received yesterday from a Head Start site in Eastern North Carolina that started a garden this year. Obviously, their garden's looking great right now, but these are two examples of raised beds. Raised beds are a great way to start a garden or add to your garden because you're adding fresh soil. So you're not really worrying about the soil quality at your site. There's a lot of reasons to think about the soil quality, but with raised beds, you kind of make that easy on yourself. You're not digging into ground around your site either. So that's also a concern. Maybe there's, you know, gas lines you don't know about, and you don't just want to be digging around your building without knowing what's down there, right? So raised beds kind of take that out of the equation. It's also kind of an ideal space to grow vegetables. Water naturally just passes through the raised bed and doesn't really hold in there as well. So raised beds are a great way to garden. Here's some other raised bed examples. This one's literally just a bale of straw. It's a very cheap way to garden. They don't last super long, but it's a fun activity you can do. And then on the right is another Head Start site that I work with. My organization actually purchased those raised beds for them. Those are hard plastic. And if you're going to have garden beds on your playground, which these are, I would highly recommend that hard plastic because let's say you have a metal raised bed or a wooden raised bed, you have, you know, little 4 and 5 year olds running full speed on that playground. If they crash into that metal raised bed or wooden raised bed, it's going to hurt a lot. Not to say that hitting that hard plastic's not going to hurt, but it'll be a much less severe injury. And I know particularly with the Head Start sites that I've worked with, they get inspected, and I've had sites that had metal raised beds on their playground that they were made to take off their site. So hard plastic can be a good option to sort of be the best of both worlds there. So let's say you're only working with a deck, or you don't have maybe the resources to start a bunch of raised beds, which can be very expensive. We can think about gardening in containers on a smaller scale. Maybe we're starting kale plants in little containers to send home with each kid in our classrooms. Um, there's much less investment, and you can grow just about anything, even inside sometimes, and in containers. Here's some more creative ways to use containers. So thinking about like a milk jug garden is a great way to talk about recycling and gardening at the same time. You can grow microgreens really easily in milk jugs. I've done some activities with schools where we start a bunch of like lettuce or cilantro seeds in a milk jug. And when they're closed up, they act as a greenhouse. And then as you can see in those milk jugs, you have a ton of plants in a small space. It's a really fun activity you can do. And those cilantro microgreens, lettuce microgreens are two that you can grow that are just really easy and taste great even after 3 weeks of growing them. They're ready to eat. Tire gardens are also a fun way to get creative with container gardens. The only thing about tire gardens is you probably shouldn't grow anything edible inside the tire garden because all the chemicals that the tire is made out of can sort of leach into that soil. So that's more of a flower garden idea, but another great way to get them thinking about recycling and gardening at the same time. So indoor gardening, we have window gardening is a great way to garden inside. If we don't have some good windows in our space, we can think about artificial light in that closet like I was talking about. Thinking about going back to window gardening, the south facing window is going to get the most light in your space. So the north facing window is going to get the least amount of light, and east and west get a similar amount. So we want to try to have things that need that sunlight in the south facing window. I have kale, lettuce, spinach in the south facing window in my house. If I was going to put them in the north side, they would just do a little less well because they'll get less sunlight. And that's the same thing when planting a garden. If we're gonna use a wall of our site as the place for our garden, the south is the most optimal just in terms of the sunlight. North is the least optimal, and then east and west is kind of different. So east is gonna get that morning sunlight. It's not very harsh. Lettuce, kale, spinach, they like that. They don't like harsh sunlight. And then the west side of our site or our house is going to get that sort of harsh mid to late day sunlight. So thinking about which window you're using or where you're putting your garden is very important because like if I put a bunch of tomatoes on the north side of my house, they're just not going to do well. They need more sunlight than that. So those initial considerations are important. And then planting your plants. So we have centers, I think, on this call from all across North Carolina. And if we all started our tomatoes in the same day, some of us would do really well. Some of our tomatoes would die 2 nights later when it frosted for the first time. So where I live in the mountains of North Carolina, we haven't had our last frost day yet. Some of you out east are already past that. You could put your tomatoes, peppers, squash, all that good stuff out now, and have no issues. So knowing which growing zone you're in is important. Extension has a great tool that I'll send to everyone on this call later this week, where you can type in your zip code. It tells you what growing zone you're in and when your last frost date is, because there are just some plants in the garden that can't stand one night of frost. So where I live, that last frost date's May 15th. As you go east North Carolina, it goes less and less. So I think even out in the coast, you're talking mid-April for their last frost date. So things like, again, tomatoes, peppers, squash, beans, they'll die as soon as they get hit by frost one time. So understanding where you live in relation to when you need to plant things is really vital. Otherwise, we'll put all this effort and then, all those tomatoes would die in one night when it gets frosty outside. So that's where that planting calendar comes in. So let's say you live in zone 7A, which would be like Guilford County, sort of Piedmont. You can find a planting calendar for zone 7 that will tell you the exact date within a range of maybe a week or 2 weeks to put every single vegetable out. Extension has a great planting calendar resource that I'll also send to y'all later this week. So you can find out what growing zone you're in and use that planting calendar to at least have a ballpark reference of, okay, I want to grow dill and cilantro and basil this year. Now I at least know within a reasonable doubt that they'll be successful if I plant them this time. So for newer gardeners especially, this is a really important resource because it kind of takes the thinking out of it. Another way to look at this too is that in the fall and spring, we're eating the roots and leaves of plants. And in the summer, we're eating their fruit. There's exceptions to that rule, but that's kind of a good rule of thumb. So when it's colder out, we're growing things like lettuce, spinach, and kale that we're eating the leaves, carrots as well, we're eating their roots, and radishes, we're eating their roots. And when it warms up in the summer, we can eat the fruits of plants like cucumbers and tomatoes and things like that. So that's another way to look at it, but that planning calendar takes a lot of the guesswork out of it for you. Also thinking about the available space. So this is one issue inexperienced gardeners can get themselves into easily. Like let's say a tomato, for example. A large tomato might need 3 feet of space around it. And it's really tempting to just use that space up, put tomatoes 6 inches apart, things like that. But if I put tomatoes too close together, none of them will be happy. None of them will do well. So knowing how big the plant's going to be at its maturity and giving it adequate space leading up to that's important. Otherwise, we'll kind of ruin all the plants at the same time. And with tomatoes and squash, that's especially important because they can be susceptible to diseases where their leaves don't get dry. So giving them space to sort of air out, not bunch together, and not be touching each other's leaves is very important. And the planting method's important too. So where I live, I don't really have enough time to put a tomato seed in the ground and watch it grow before it bears fruit. So it's important for me to start my tomatoes inside or buy started tomato plants at my farmer's market or at my, garden center. In other parts of North Carolina, that's not as much as an issue, but some plants really don't like to be started in the ground and some plants don't like to get transplanted. So just kind of knowing which way a plant prefers is important. Carrots is a good example of a plant that needs to get planted in the ground from seed. If I try to start a carrot in a pot and transplant it, it's probably going to die or at least not be happy with me because they have long tap roots that are not supposed to get disturbed. So if I transplant that carrot, that tap root's going to freak out and I'll just have a better time putting that carrot in the ground from seed than trying to transplant it. So I talked about seasonality some earlier, but here's just some examples of things that you could plant in spring and summer and fall. And even winter in North Carolina as well. So especially out east in the Piedmont and the coast, you can grow a lot of vegetables, especially leaves in the winter. So we're looking at kale, garlic's really meant to be grown from the fall to the winter. Lettuce, spinach would do well in the winter as well, especially if we cover them up on those really cold nights. Spring and fall, you're almost planting the exact same thing. So most spring crops like carrots and radishes and leafy greens and peas, you can plant them in February, March, and April and replant them in the fall, maybe it's August, September, October. So you can have 2 plantings of those same ones each year. And those planting calendars that I'll send you have all this information in it as well. But that's kind of a good rule of thumb is that you can plant the spring vegetables again in fall. And then summer, so really right now for most of North Carolina, we can be planting all these warm weather plants, the ones you really sometimes think about when we're gardening. So those tomatoes, peppers, and squash. And here's some really easy vegetables to grow. Carrots have a hard time getting started. They like the ground really wet to germinate, but once they get started, carrots are really easy to grow. There's not many more fun things than pulling a carrot out of the ground and having 4- and 5-year-olds pull a carrot out of the ground. You're almost showing them a magic trick because they can see nothing except some green leaves, and then they're pulling this, 5-inch carrot out of the ground. Peas are very easy to grow. They don't need much nutrition from the soil. They're actually putting in nitrogen to the soil. Peas are very easy to grow. Cucumbers as well. One cucumber plant will get really large, produce a lot of cucumbers. And radishes are probably the easiest vegetable in the garden to grow. You can plant one even in not the best soil. And usually in 30 to 45 days, will be ready to eat, ready to pull out. And some easier, maybe perennial fruits to grow. Strawberries are very easy to grow, come back every year and actually clone themselves. So one strawberry plant one year could be five the next year, so on and so forth. Blueberries are pretty easy as well. And apple trees are fun, and some smaller varieties can produce fruit in 5 years and stay pretty low to the ground. So thinking about lesson planning, these are pictures that are grainy now, but this was a garden I worked in. At this point, it was 11 years ago, with some college students on the right and some preschoolers on the left. And thinking about some ways to sort of make lesson planning simple for this population. So basic gardening tasks are great things to be teaching young children. Even something as simple as fertilizing, pruning, mulching are all lessons unto themselves. Watering is probably one of the first things I would teach young children, because really you want to water the base of the plant. You don't want to be watering their leaves. A lot of diseases are carried by leaves that don't get dry. So it's important to learn to water the base of the plant. Kids will fight over who gets to water, so you got to watch out for that. But watering is a great lesson. You could spend 20 minutes teaching them how to water. Really, as a rule of thumb, you want to water your garden really deeply once or twice a week, and that's it. So we want to train those roots to go find water underground, spread out their root system, and that'll make stronger plants that can withstand droughts, withstand things a lot easier. If I'm watering a little bit every day, we're going to train that plant to have a really small root system, not go look for that water. And now it's relying on me being out there 6 days a week, 7 days a week watering. So that's a really important lesson to teach them. When you see water pooling on the surface, usually that's a good time to stop watering. That's how you know you've watered enough. Weeding is another great lesson for kids. Weeding is really important for some plants. Some plants do not want to be competing for their space. So weeding is really important. The idea of a weed is also a lesson in itself. It's kind of a man-made concept, right? A weed is usually a plant that we don't want around. And so humans are labeling these plants, even though some of them are very useful. Like a dandelion is a weed to a lot of people, but you can eat the flowers, you can eat the leaves. So weeding is a whole lesson unto itself, and is really important in gardening. Mulching is kind of a great lesson too. And mulching is one of the easiest ways to stop yourself from having to weed all the time. If I get my tomato plant going, you can mulch around the base. So now weeds aren't even able to pop up. So I'm saving myself time. Mulching also holds that moisture in. So watering is more effective. A great activity to do with this age group is water just a patch of dirt and just see what happens to the soil when you water it. Usually the soil will move all around, will get scrambled, and then you put mulch on the same patch of dirt, then water it. It usually all stays together. So it even helps your soil stay there, stay more moist. Mulching is really important too. Fertilizing is a lot of fun. I try to use organic fertilizers at any site I'm working at, and teach kids very basic things like, this is food for plants, just like humans eat healthy food, plants do too. There's some really fun ones you can do, like fish emulsion. Smells terrible. That always gets a rise out of the kids I'm working with. So another really fun activity in the garden is just hunting for insects, or hunting for a lot of different things. But let's talk about a bug hunt first. Nothing gets kids more excited than finding bugs in the garden, figuring out what their purpose is, what they're doing there. a good question to ask them is this bug beneficial for our garden? Is it harmful for our garden? And sometimes we don't know the answer and we need to go, look in a field guide for insects and see what this insect's doing. There's a squash beetle that looks very similar to a ladybug. It almost looks exactly like a ladybug, except it's yellow. And to the untrained eye, you might think, oh, that's just a yellow ladybug. But actually those will kill your entire squash crop. So little things like that are fun for kids to learn about, learn their life cycles. Oftentimes insects will ruin your best plants in the garden, but in a learning garden, I view that as a good thing. Now we're learning about, their life cycle. This caterpillar that's eating all my kale, a moth actually laid its eggs on there, so we get to learn all of that in one fell swoop in this insect hunt. A worm hunt's also really fun. Worms are a whole nother garden lesson. One time I was doing a worm hunt, and while we're searching for worms, like a worm that was no less than 2 feet long just kind of emerged from the ground. I've never seen a worm this big. And the audible fever pitch that the kids got to when they saw this, what they call granddaddy worm, was amazing. And I'll never forget that day. But seeing their reaction to this huge worm, watching them, take in how worms are beneficial to the garden was really cool. So a simple activity like a worm hunt can sort of teach them about worms, get them excited about these creatures that are all over the garden space. And a soil hunt's fun too. So even at one childcare site, you could have 3 or 4 different types of soil spread out around, and just finding the differences, kind of seeing how they feel, maybe how they take on water differently, just getting them thinking about, oh, wow, there's more than one type of dirt. How might that impact the plants or the garden I'm working with? And all these are ways to get them engaged and involved and a participant in the learning rather than me just talking at them for 20 minutes. Planting is another great activity to do. And I always say you can make a whole lesson out of each life cycle of the plant. So we're talking about planting peas right here. Learning how to plant peas is one thing. Then they learn how to take care of peas. They maybe get to see a pea flower for the first time. And then we learn to harvest and eat the peas with maybe a tasting activity, show them how to harvest gently. So just in this one life cycle of a pea plant, you could have 3 little mini lessons spread out over the course of, 2 or 3 months. But planting is a very fun activity for them to do. I talked about this earlier, but a milk jug greenhouse, the idea of, let's say, growing basil or dill, something very easy to grow, that within 2 weeks they could plant these outside in the garden and be able to harvest all this basil or all this dill that's ready to eat. They could, you could send it home with them depending on the rules of your school, things like that. And you don't need much for this. This is, almost free. So we need some milk jugs, the seeds, maybe some duct tape to actually tape our greenhouse up after we open it up, and some potting soil. And that's really all you need for this activity. Really fun, really easy, a good way to sort of reinforce the idea of recycling in the garden. I thought about how much the population likes worms, how much young children get a rise out of seeing a worm. I worked at a Montessori school for a few years, and there was a kid in one of my classes that he never spoke. I did not hear him speak for about 6 months of being there. And I brought my worm bin in one day, and he started talking nonstop when he saw the worms. It was like a switch flipped off. Something in his brain, just when he saw the worm, he had to talk. And there is just this sort of natural reaction to seeing worms, seeing how they work. And something like a worm farm can be stored in a closet at your school. Maybe a teacher at your school already has one. I actually got mine started from a teacher at my son's school. She just gave me some worms from her worm bin, and then you're off to the races. But you don't need much. A plastic bin is what mine live in. They need some paper as sort of their bedding. It does need to be a certain type of worm, so you need red wiggler worms. They need some air holes, so you can sort of drill those into the plastic bin. And then now we're giving them our food scraps from school, mainly vegetable scraps or fruit scraps, eggshells if we have them. But it doesn't take much to keep them alive and happy. They don't eat very much. You could feed them, twice a month, and they're happy with that. And you put a little bit of soil in there too to sort of get them going. But they produce a really rich vermicompost that you can put back into your garden. But as an educational tool, it's a great way to teach kids about composting and recycling our waste and getting it back into the garden. And the worms are doing all the work for you. So we talked about growing microgreens a little bit earlier, but this is an incredibly easy activity you could do in a windowsill. You could do outside very, very easily as well. Lots of different seeds make good microgreens. So we're talking peas, beans, radishes, kale, cilantro. There's a lot more, but the nice thing is that it doesn't really matter what your soil quality is. Most of the nutrition in a microgreen is in the seed. So even if I'm doing it in a seed starting mix that has very little nutritional value, these things are packed with nutrition from the seed. A lot of these can be completed in 2 to 3 weeks, and a great addition to a salad, sandwiches, things like that. And it's fun to just have them taste each individual one, because let's say like a cilantro microgreen tastes just like a fully grown cilantro leaf, but it's all packed into a little, tiny 1-inch sprout. And again, very, very easy: potting soil, a growing light, a container to have them in, seeds, and a heating mat. If we're outside, you can forget about the heating mat or grow light, but a very easy activity to do at your site. So we talked about growing plants inside a little bit, but here's some good choices to grow inside. So let's say you have a south-facing window you'd like to use. You could easily grow basil, lettuce, kale, chard, and spinach in there. I've been growing kale in my window in my kitchen since January, and I live in the mountains, so you can really extend the season that way too. But if you only have a few windows in your classroom, maybe you don't have a garden outside, you could still have kids learn how to start these plants and tend to them. You obviously get less of a harvest this way, but it's still a fun way to get something and also learn about the life cycle of these kale and spinach plants. And again, that south-facing window is going to get the most sun, but even if you have like an east or west facing window, that will still get plenty of sunlight to grow some of these plants. So I wanted to show a video of a Head Start site that I worked with in Winston-Salem that started a garden, so you can kind of see maybe the impact of one of these programs after you implement it.
Right beside the pansies. Right here? Sure. All right, it's a pansy.
I have been a teacher longer than I've been a farmer. I'm kind of learning right along with the children, and I bring what I've learned to the school garden to where we get to learn together.
The pre-K program we have here is really led by, a small number of dedicated teachers who make it what it is for the kids.
With small children, you've got to address the whole child. So Farm to Early Childhood Education Program allows kiddos the opportunity to incorporate knowledge in a lot of different ways. And one that I think is most important with early childhood is sensory experiences. If you can get them to touch and feel and put their hands in the dirt, I think that engages them on a different level and makes them able to retain information that they've learned better in the long run, because you've incorporated all of their senses.
They really learn how to teamwork. They learn how to teamwork, they learn how to share, they learn where their vegetables come from.
For me, it's also really important to note the social emotional learning components of gardening, especially in schools. Kids come out here and they know to be gentle. They know, not to pull up plants. They come out, they talk to the carrots really nicely like they're babies.
Just being in the classroom with them, like the kids are super jazzed to be out here and be walking in the garden and labeling things in the garden and eating things from the garden. Like this kid just came out here and like took a bite of cabbage. Like how he was just like, I want to take a nibble of it, Like they're intrigued, they're interested. We're piquing their interest in this subject, and I think that's where it starts.
Teachers interested in getting involved with the Farm to ECE program, I think, should first contact their extension office. Since they're going to be familiar with the program, they're going to be familiar with local resources for gardens, and they're going to be able to work with you no matter what your experience is. That's what I would say to get started. And then just continue your education. It's really an experiment all the time.
We're not always successful at something new, but I think most of the time when we try something new that we'll see that we could try it differently next time, or we can see the value in the effort.
Or sweet potato?
Sweet potato.
It's a sweet potato.
This has been one of the most exciting years I've ever had. All summer, it was so much fun watching them dig into the ground, planting seeds, watching them grow, and then being a part of actually creating something. Because they said, we did this. I said, yes, you did. And I think teachers will see that the joy and the absolute beauty and what the kids get from it, from feeling that they have really accomplished something.
We would like to take what we've got now and incorporate art and science through garden art in our outdoor space. So this is really just a starting point for us. We want to make sure that we take baby steps so that it doesn't become unmanageable, but I think we've got the buy-in to really use the garden as a learning tool and be an example to other schools who want to also utilize their outdoor space.
Trey, did you take a bite out of that? You did a little nibble? That'll work.
So that's the end of my presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions about gardening at my email right here. But if y'all have questions for me right now, feel free to get off mute and ask me, or you can put any questions you have in the chat as well, and I'd be happy to answer them. And also, if there's any specific topics around gardening that you'd like to learn about in the next few learning bursts, please put those in the chat as well, and I'd be happy to sort of weave those into the next two learning bursts.
Hey Cal, could I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
So we live in Boone and there is a abundance of deer population. So do you have any recommendations on plants that are relatively deer resistant or the deer aren't fond of?
Yeah, I can do a whole thing on deer next time. Deer are probably my biggest garden nemesis. I actually used to live in Boone up until about a few years ago. And now I live in Allegheny County, and there's about 15 deer that sleep in my backyard here. And they like to eat my garden. The best thing to do with deer is to figure out a way to keep them out. So a very cheap and easy way is like a floating row cover, which is essentially like a cloth. It's white if you haven't seen it. It's a cloth that sun can penetrate, and you can maybe put that over your plants. That's what I do here. There are some things I don't like, but most of the things they don't like aren't what we would consider great vegetables to grow in the garden. So I can talk more about it next week, but unfortunately you need a 6-foot fence at least to keep deer out. And that's not possible at a lot of the sites, right? Having a 6-foot fence that would keep deer out is very expensive for even a pretty small garden space. So I'll talk more about that next week, but the easiest way is to just protect your plants with something small like a floating row cover. And I can show you pictures of that next week as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions for me?
Kyle, this is Sharonda. I actually have a question for you. It goes back to the carrots.
Yeah.
And so can you start them in those pots that they have out now that you can transplant the whole pot into the ground? Or you just figure no, just put it straight into the ground?
Yeah, so like a peat pot.
Yeah,
I would rather just put it in the ground, Sharonda, because the thing with a peat pot is it's great. You can put it in the ground and it'll decompose, but
correct.
it might not decompose as fast as my carrot wants to go down. So
Got you.
you would run the risk of your carrot hitting the bottom and being like, why did you put me here? So it'd be a fun experiment to do a peat pot carrot and one in the ground, see what ends up better. But I'd probably just put mine in the ground. But again, like that's why gardens are fun, is like we could do an experiment and just see which one works out better, right?
Right. Okay, thank you. See, I have questions too, y'all. I'm learning too. Each year I learn something new.
Yeah, me too. The more I learn about gardening, the more I realize I don't know, which is kind of fun. Right?
Right.
So
Anyone else have questions now?
if there's any specific topics you'd like to learn about in the next 2 learning bursts, please put them in the chat. I'd be happy to talk about them the next few weeks. Yeah, Emma's going to send this recording out to everyone, and when she does, I'll give her some resources on the growing zones and the planting seasons and the planting calendar, and you can just click links and easily find that wherever you live. So we'll have a good idea of when to plant most vegetables in the garden. Okay, ants, squirrels, other pests. I'll talk about pests in the garden next week, Caroline, and we can kind of focus on some of the ones you just said, like groundhogs, squirrels, and ants, and deer too.
Thank you. That would be great. Crop rotation and succession planting. Cool.
Yeah, those would be fun topics next week too, Trish. I'll include those as well.
All right. Well, if folks have other ideas or comments or feedback or topics for next time. Oh, there's another question. Let's see. You got it, Kyle. You want me to read it?
Yeah, so Kelly's asking about a garden bed that they have, and it's hard for the children at the center to reach the garden bed. So what are some other options to be able to plant? That's a good question, Kelly. I'm wondering in what ways are hard for them to reach. I would say what we talked about earlier. So maybe starting seeds inside that they could transplant in single swoops in this garden bed, or they could start them and watch a teacher transplant them into the bed. That might be a good way to look at it. That's probably how I would approach that. There's also some seeds that you can broadcast, meaning you can just kind of throw some seeds out. So if they're able to sort of throw the seeds into the bed, they could broadcast that way, which would be pretty easy. Those are just a few quick ways on the top of my head, but I'd have to see what you're talking about more specifically, I think, to answer it better than that. Okay, we can talk about broadcasting seeds next week, Kelly. That'd be fun.
A lot of demand for your knowledge, Kyle. We appreciate you being here with us. Thank you so much. I was going to say, if there's any other questions, they could always email. I know you put your email in the chat, right? Didn't I see that?
Oh, did I put it in the chat? Let me put it in the chat. Oh, we got some pictures now too.
Oh, this is so fun. I love this interactiveness.
Yeah, so this is kind of what I was talking about. Like, you get a raised bed, they're usually like 4 feet-ish wide, but a 5-year-old is gonna have trouble even maybe getting to, or like a 3-year-old especially is gonna have a hard time getting the middle of the raised bed. So when you're planning it, I would try to do as thin as possible if I'm working with very young children. But for that bed, I think broadcasting will work very well. Like, you could have them broadcast, and then a teacher could just sort of rake them in a little bit, but we'll talk about broadcasting some next week for you. Yeah, so a 2 to 3 and 4-year-olds, yeah. So we'll cover some ways maybe they could do it without crawling in the bed as much. Sometimes you have to do that, but that's obviously not optimal, right? Okay, go for it, Caroline. Sorry.
Oh no, it's fine. I'm loving these pictures. I didn't even know you could do that. That's awesome.
That's new to me too.
Yeah, this is great. No, I don't want to cut anybody off. If you have any questions, I mean, now it's definitely the time. But if you think of anything between now and next week, I'm sure you could go ahead and email Kyle or email one of us and we could forward it to him. But yeah, I'm looking forward to next week, and we just want to thank you, Kyle, for being here with us, and everyone for joining. And I know there will be some watching the recording at their local watch party, so we want to thank everyone for doing that as well. And yeah, if we could just put some gratitude in the chat for Kyle for joining us today. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week. Yay!